Are you sick of scrolling through Netflix and Hulu searching for movies that are high quality and family friendly? Christian Cinema has thousands of movies available on demand that you can watch anytime, anywhere. When you sign up for a Giving membership, a premium offering from Christian Cinema, you can watch 5 free movies every month. Learn more about becoming a Giving member at givingcompany.com/Giving membership and start watching great movies today. The other side of the road is safe, where we sidestep being bothered and avoid getting involved. But rolling up your sleeves and boldly going where few dare to tread, that's walking through Samaria. Each week on our podcast, we introduce you to the special few who walk in the spirit of the Good Samaritan. On behalf of the Giving Company and your hosts, David Hendrickson and Dan Riveros, welcome to the Walking Through Samaria podcast. Hey everybody, welcome to the Walking Through Samaria podcast. I am your host, Dan Riveros, with my co-host,
David Hendrickson.
How you doing, man?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing good.
Nice to see you.
It's a Friday, you know.
We are without masks here in our recording room, but we're more than 6 feet apart, so I think we're okay. Yeah.
We got a special guest today, man.
We have a very special guest, Dan, because in all sincerity, this is one of the leaders in, frankly, both the what we'll call the secular world and the ministry world that I admire most. And because my background isn't nearly at the level that our guest is, but my path was the same, which was working in corporate America, traditional secular businesses, and then making a decision that was a challenging decision to move into ministry, nonprofit, kind of compassion, cause-based environments. So I'm stalling a little bit to introduce our guest, but Rich Stearns, welcome to the Walking Through Samaria podcast.
Thank you, David. Great to be with you.
It is great to hear your voice. Are you in the Seattle area today or somewhere else?
Yeah, we live in the Seattle area in Bellevue, across the lake from Seattle, and we've lived here for 23 years now.
Wow. Well, that's a beautiful place. I've been there many times. Our listeners know, Rich, that the catalyst for this podcast was actually some time that Dan, my co-host, and I spent with World Vision in Ethiopia. But before we get into all that, I'm going to read your bio, if you don't mind, for our listeners, so we can kind of give them the entirety of your background, and then we're going to talk about what you've been up to.
Okay.
Here we go. Richard Stearns is a leader who has been tested as a CEO in both secular companies and also as the head of one of the world's largest Christian ministries. After stints as the CEO of both Parker Brothers and Lenox, Stearns accepted the invitation to leave his corporate career to become the president of World Vision U.S. in June of 1998, where he became the longest-serving president in their 70-year history. During his tenure there, he implemented corporate best practices, lowering overhead while tripling revenue. His leadership in calling the American church to respond to some of the greatest crises of our time, notably the HIV and AIDS pandemic and the global refugee crisis, challenged Christians to embrace a bold vision for compassion, mercy, and justice. In his latest book, Lead Like It Matters to God, Stearns shares the leadership principles he has learned over the course of his remarkable career. As a leader who has navigated both secular and sacred spaces, Stearns claims that the values Christian leaders embrace in their workplaces are actually more important than the results they achieve, that God is more concerned about a leader's character than a leader's success. Stearns holds a bachelor's degree from Cornell University and an MBA from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Rich actually retired from World Vision in 2018 after 20 years. He and his wife, Reneé, have been World Vision supporters since 1984. They have 5 children. As he mentioned, he lives in Bellevue, Washington, in the Seattle area. Rich, again, it is great to have you on the podcast.
Rich, welcome, man.
So I fear, Rich, that I may have left out the number of grandchildren you have in your bio, because you do have 5 children, but I'm pretty certain there's grandchildren running around as well. Can you tell us about your grandchildren and just how is the Stearns family doing these days amongst COVID?
Yeah, so we do have 5 children, and 4 of them have fled the area, maybe to escape from their parents. So our kids, we're in the Seattle area. We have one daughter who lives there. One daughter made it only to Spokane, about 4 hours away. And then we've got a son in Chicago, a son in Virginia. and a daughter in Brooklyn, New York, and so she got as far away from us as possible.
That's the opposite side of the country. That's right.
But we also have 6 grandsons. You know, all 6 of our grandchildren are boys, and we have a $10,000 reward for the first girl that can be produced. So, but you know, like a lot of folks, we have not seen some of our kids for over a year now, and our grandkids, because we haven't traveled. But just this month, we're flying out for a baptism to Chicago. We've been vaccinated now, and
terrific.
Our youngest grandson is being baptized in Chicago. And,
wow.
And then we're going to see our son in Virginia shortly after that too. So.
Well, your son Andy and his wife Kirsten, who used to be here in the Atlanta area, I just want to personally say that I am disappointed that they moved from Atlanta, because it was a good excuse for you to come to Atlanta, and a few of those times I actually got to see you face to face. So anyway, life moves on, right?
Yeah. Well, funny, they tried to get us to move to Atlanta. They said, "Oh, it's great here, Dad. You and Mom should move here." And then 2 years later, they moved.
Yeah,
you know?
poof,
So we
the
would
bait
have
and
been
switch.
in Atlanta.
That's right.
So the lesson there is, don't follow your kids around the country, or you'll be moving every 2 years.
Very good. Well, our listeners have heard this a couple of times, Rich, but Dan and I have to share with you so our listeners can hear how this podcast began, because we owe it to World Vision. In 2017, I think it was, Dan. Yep. We Giving Company, through our iDisciple platform, have been contributors to the World Vision WASH program, water, sanitation, and hygiene in sub-Saharan Africa, since 2015, the summer of 2015. And so in 2017, Marianne Osborne, who was our relationship manager at the time, it's now Mike Gillespie, invited us on a vision trip. And so I think 5 of us, Dan, went over to Ethiopia with Marianne. And Eddie Brown was there. We got to spend some time with him and meet his family. Mesrach was there, Mesrach Ayele, and we got to meet her husband and her kids. And so we had a wonderful time. And one of the things that World Vision did while we were there, we thought we were there to see water. And as you know, Rich, sometimes you see water, sometimes you don't see water, because World Vision really wants people to understand how impactful it is. But in one of our meetings, we got introduced to the Interfaith Forum. And I believe the Interfaith Forum is in multiple countries, but this one specifically was in Mekelle in Ethiopia. And we met Christian leaders and Muslim leaders who were working together in the interest of child protection, reducing child marriages, reducing divorce, reducing abuse in the home. And we found out, Dan, that not only were they working together to meet humanitarian needs of children in the country, but they were actually becoming friends. They were the Christian leaders were helping to build mosques. The Muslim leaders were helping to build Sunday schools. They were going to one another's birthday parties. Dan, I always say, is the one who got to cut the bread with one of the Muslim leaders and one of the Christian leaders, and kind of that typical ceremony with espresso that they do in Ethiopia. And I was almost speechless, Rich, in the entire meeting, because you hear so much about religious conflict around the world. Mm-hmm. And I'm not trying to minimize that as an issue, but here we were in Ethiopia, and we were seeing leaders, religious leaders, grasp hands and work together in the interest of humanitarian progress. And so Dan and I did some research, and we found out from the parable in Luke chapter 10, many Christians know this, that there's real significance in a Samaritan being the hero of the story, because when the Jewish man was beaten, robbed, and left by the side of the road, Jews and Samaritans at that time, Jesus' time, were religiously, ethnically, culturally, socially, politically at odds with one another, and that's probably an understatement. It would seem like the Democrats and the Republicans in the U.S. today, or maybe the Christians the Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland, maybe the Muslims in China. I mean, really, really tough conflict, and yet the Samaritan is the hero of the story. And so we've enjoyed this podcast, Dan, right, for the last 2.5 seasons, just hearing real stories about Good Samaritan activity in line with the parable in Luke chapter 10. So first of all, I want to say thank you to you and World Vision for making that trip possible. You were still there when we went over, because it was moving in our hearts and in our ministries. Dan and I just felt so compelled to start talking about what it truly means to be a good Samaritan as an evangelical and as believers. So I want to say thank you. And with that very, very long introduction, do you kind of have a story or two from your time at World Vision that really rocked your world, like Dan and I were in 2017 in Michele?
Yeah, I have so many. It's hard to pick one. But yeah, I'll mention one from early on. I think it was 1999. I went to Peru, where World Vision works, high up in the Andes Mountains. So we drove up to this very remote farming community, probably 14,000 feet up in the Andes Mountains. And as you can imagine, the climate is pretty hostile. And even in the summer, it's cold up there, and you know, the land up in that part of the mountain range is rocky and rough terrain. And we went to the home of a widow. Her husband had died maybe 9 months earlier and left her alone on this barren piece of land with 2 or 3 children. And now they were subsistence farmers, so she now had to plow the land, feed the livestock, raise the food for the family. And she was just a broken woman, just despairing over her situation and how she could possibly continue, and provide for her children. And we had a time of prayer with her. Her name was Octaviana. And I said, Octaviana, what do you pray for? And she said, I pray every day to the Lord that he will see me and my children on this mountain and that he will send help. Mm-hmm. I pray that the Lord will see me and that he will send help. And I, all of a sudden, had a lightning bolt of insight. Here I was, the president of World Vision, one of the largest relief and development organizations in the world. And I was 6,000 miles away from Seattle, Washington, and 14,000 feet up in the Andes Mountains. And I'm sitting in this woman's thatched hut as an answer to her prayer. Yeah. She had prayed that God would send help. And he didn't just send help, he sent the president of World Vision, of all people, to her home. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's the way God works, right? Yeah. Each one of us is the answer to someone's prayer. Mm. Each one of us is the answer to someone's prayer. So that equipped me for the next 19 years at World Vision to realize, Lord, whose prayer am I the answer to today? Whose prayer is World Vision the answer to today? And if you're listening, whose prayer are you the answer to today? Because in God's economy, that's the way he does his work in the world. He uses us. We are the hands and feet of Christ in the world.
That's good.
That's very good. It's actually been, I think this week was a year or a couple years, like it's the anniversary of when we were over there.
We did go in April. Yeah. That's exactly right. Yeah,
Alex sent me a picture of us on the airplane.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's our guests have included Steve Haas and Dr. Ray Norman, Mary Ann Osborne, just to name a few, all who have come with connections from World Vision. And now we have you, man. So what's your connection with World Vision these days?
Well, I'm a pensioner.
Nice.
The board was kind enough to kind of grant me the title of President Emeritus of World Vision U.S.
There you go.
And so, I try to be available to the new CEO, Edgar Sandoval, for occasional speaking engagements or representing World Vision in different ways. I'm kind of an ambassador for World Vision when they need me. In fact, tomorrow night, my wife and I are speaking at a fundraising dinner virtually for a group in Portland, Oregon, who are doing a fundraiser for their World Vision project, a volunteer group down there. And they've asked Reneé and I to be the keynote speakers tomorrow night. So we do a little bit of that. Next week, I'm doing a donor event with World Vision for CEOs who are World Vision donors, and we're going to do a exploration of my new book, Lead Like It Matters to God, and talk about leadership and what it means to be a Christian leader. So, I'm helping in ways I can. And of course, Reneé and I are donors to World Vision and have been since 1984.
That's awesome. Well, Rich, I know a few people know this, but I get such a chuckle out of your path to World Vision. So with the help of Amazon and Google and some other stalking platforms, this is how I believe your career can be traced to World Vision. We start at Gillette. So we kind of start with, I don't know, razors and antiperspirant and I don't know, other things like that. We go to Parker Brothers. That's games. I remember when you dressed up as one of the characters from Monopoly. I think after that you went to Franklin Mint. That's like fancy collectibles. Mm-hmm. And then finally, he's with me so far. Don't hang up, Rich.
Yeah.
And then Lenox, China. And in 1998, you wind up at World Vision. Please give our listeners a glimpse into your leap of faith, because truly that's what it was. Because you kind of had some bougie jobs, right? Some cushy CEO jobs, and then you go to World Vision.
Yeah, it is about as ridiculous as Peter the fisherman becoming a fisher of men. And, if you look throughout Scripture, it seems like God always had a bit of a sense of humor in terms of the people he chose to be leaders in important moments in the history of Israel or the history of the church. And he almost always picked unlikely people. Think about the Apostle Paul, who hated the Christians and literally oversaw the stoning of Stephen, the first martyr of the church. And David, who was the runt of Jesse's litter, he had, I think, 10 sons, and he didn't even bring David to meet the prophet Samuel. But see, God chose David to slay Goliath and to be the next king of Israel. And Moses, who had been banished from Egypt, he chose Moses to go back to Egypt to confront the Pharaoh. And again, Peter the fisherman. So I have kind of a ridiculous resume. And, when this all happened, I was at Lenox, and the CEO and master of all I surveyed there. And the phone rang one day, and it was a headhunter. And he was representing World Vision. And to make a very long story short, I just kept explaining to this guy, I said, you don't understand. I'm running a luxury goods company. Before that, I was selling Monopoly games and Nerf balls.
Yeah.
I have no theological degree. I have never been to Africa. I know nothing about global poverty. I've never done any fundraising. Other than that, I'm a perfect candidate. But he, I just kept trying to say no and trying to get off the phone, because I also had a sense in my spirit that this was a dangerous phone call.
Yes.
I'm not sure I wanted to go where this phone call might be leading me to go. And then the recruiter, who was a believer, asked me a different question. He said, Rich, let me ask you this. Are you willing to be open to God's will for your life? And that question stopped me in my tracks. It stopped me in my tracks, because as a Christian, you want to say, of course I want to be open to God's will for my life. That's what we do as Christians. But in this case, this was not a hypothetical question. This was a question that basically said, are you willing to quit your CEO job that you worked 23 years to get? Are you willing to turn in your corporate Jaguar, your company car? Are you willing to sell that dream house that you and Reneé bought a few years ago, a fieldstone farmhouse on 5 acres? Are you willing to pull your kids out of school and move them to Seattle, Washington, where the sun never shines and the Mariners never win? Are you willing to do that, Rich? Are you open to my will for your life? And of course, David, underneath those questions were questions like, Rich, are you willing to follow me into the refugee camps?
Yeah.
Are you willing to hold dying babies in your arms and see disaster victims who have lost everything? Are you willing to enter into the world's pain for my sake? And those were heavy questions and difficult questions to answer. And in the end, and I've written this in prior books, I was no Christian superhero. I was a whimpering coward, frankly, in this. I did not want to do it. I was like Moses, Lord, please send someone else to do this. Surely there's got to be better candidates out there than me. But in the end, the board offered me the job, and I accepted it pretty much out of grudging obedience. Like, Lord, I don't want to do this. I think it's a big mistake, but it just seems like this is what you want me to do, and so I will do it, but I'm not happy about it. And so I did say yes, and we moved our family, and I was terrified that first few months at World Vision because I was afraid I would mess up one of the great ministries in the world. and I found myself just totally relying on the Lord, saying, Lord, not my will, not my skill, but yours. And the Lord honored my obedience, and the next 20 years were the best 20 years of my life.
That's awesome.
The most fulfilling and the most wonderful years of my life.
Very cool, very cool.
We mention this from time to time on the podcast, Rich, just the power of yes, but maybe the release of yes as well. And I certainly want to say for the Giving Company employees, because we talk about and touch the impact of the water programs on a global basis every single day here, and we're just so grateful that you did say yes. We've put a water point in Kenya, and we've got the second one that is getting ready to go in that we're waiting for the report on, and it's just such meaningful, rewarding work, and so on behalf of everybody here, I certainly want to say thank you that you did lean into those promptings, because I think a lot of times it is easy to say no or say this isn't what God's asking me to do, or it's not the Holy Spirit nudging me, and just stay the normal course. So one of the things I'd like to sort of lean or edge towards your new book for a second, and I'm going to kind of ramp up to this because it does combine your World Vision work with some of the things that I read about in the book, Lead Like It Matters to God. One of the things, and I mentioned this on the Facebook group, and you were kind enough to respond to it, but you talked about courage and you talked about perseverance, and the topic that you were talking about, at least partially at the time, was the global AIDS epidemic, the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And this is a podcast, this is a conversation about Good Samaritans truly, according to the parable in Luke chapter 10, are not just not walking by, they're not just taking the time and the sacrifice to walk across the road, but they're often doing it in service to people that are not like them. And you mobilized World Vision, which meant mobilizing churches, which I'm just going to say probably meant mobilizing evangelicals to lean into the global AIDS epidemic. But this took some work. I think you kind of disclosed in the book that people just didn't jump on board. This took some work and some messaging and some encouragement from you to the American church community and to World Vision as well. But what a great picture of a Good Samaritan. Can you give a little more color to our listeners about what that process was like to get World Vision and then the church mobilized to care and then provide for those suffering from AIDS?
Mm-hmm. David, in 1998, when, I was called to World Vision, I knew nothing about the AIDS pandemic. All I knew is that what I knew about AIDS is it was a disease of the gay community in the United States. And it was a culture war issue. I mean, Christians were actually, it was a taboo subject almost. There was a tremendous stigma associated with AIDS. There was a lot of fearfulness in our culture about, should we allow children who are HIV positive to attend schools with our children? And it was kind of a culture war issue, and I didn't know much about it. And one of the things I didn't realize is what AIDS was doing in Africa. Yeah. In Africa, AIDS was not a disease of the gay community. It was a heterosexually transmitted disease. And it was killing an entire generation of parents. And at that time, it had left behind 13 million orphaned children who had lost a mother or a father or both to this disease. And the typical path of the disease was the husband would be promiscuous, and he would contract HIV and bring it home and infect his wife. And then his wife might, a year later, give birth to a child who was HIV positive through birth, through childbirth. And so it was just a devastating disease, what it was doing. And it was a silent killer in Africa. And I actually encountered it on my very first trip in 1998 to Uganda. And it felt like a punch in the gut, because I saw these orphan children and I said, what is the world? Why isn't the world doing anything here? Why isn't the church doing something here? We got to help these orphans, these children. We got to. So I came back to the U.S., the new guy who had been selling fine china 60 days earlier.
But you have a platform now. Yeah.
Yeah. And I said, we've got to respond. We've got to mobilize World Vision and our donors to respond to this. And I got one of those looks in the conference room. Everybody's kind of looking at each other like, who's going to tell them?
Yeah, right. Somebody tell him.
The new guy, the emperor, that he's wearing no clothes. And finally, the marketing VP spoke up and he said, Rich, he said, this issue is incredibly controversial. There is no support for this among our donor base and our churches. And he said, we are a G-rated ministry that helps families and children, and this is an R-rated issue. And he basically said, we can't go there, Wow. And I remember saying, well, if the churches feel that way, if the donors feel that way, then they're wrong.
There you go.
I said, who's going to tell them they're wrong? And if we don't tell them, God help us as a ministry, because we're eyewitnesses to this human suffering. And if we don't speak up on this, it was kind of our Esther moment. And, you mentioned the parable of the Good Samaritan. The American church was in the position of the priest and the Levite.
Yeah,
right?
just walking by.
So are you going to walk by on the other side of the road while 13 million children have been orphaned and tens of millions of people have died from this disease? Or are you going to roll up your sleeves and help and pitch in and do something? And so what I agreed to do was they said, well, we need to do some marketing research to find out, where this issue is in our donor base and our child sponsors and our church partners. So we did some research, and even I was shocked, because I thought, well, here was the question we asked. Would you be willing, and these were evangelical Christians, would you be willing to help children who had lost their parents to AIDS by donating to a reputable Christian organization that was going to help them? Only 3% of evangelical Christians said, yes, I would definitely be willing to help.
Yikes.
3%.
Wow. Yikes.
Atheists were saying we'd help, but Christians were not. And so the marketing people said, see, we told you. And they thought I was going to back down, right? And I said, well, we're going there anyways, because if we don't tell them, who's going to? So we mounted a 5-year campaign of awareness. We went on an 18-city tour with this message, and we spoke to pastors, we spoke to donors, we spoke to newspaper editorial boards in places like Knoxville and Philadelphia and Minnesota, and we just kept banging the drum about this disease. And we centered our campaign around the verse from James. I think it's James 1:27, that pure and undefiled religion is this, to care for widows and orphans in their distress. Yeah. And we talked about the widows and orphans that had been left behind, and the grandmothers that were raising their grandchildren. And slowly and surely, we started to change minds and hearts. And we sent more than 100. You mentioned Steve Haas. Steve Haas took probably 100, 200 pastors to Africa over those 5 years. We'd fly over with the pastors. We'd say, you got to see it for yourself. And those pastors would come back on fire. I had no idea. I had never imagined the human suffering until I saw it with my own eyes. And they mobilized their churches. And, there were other voices. Rick Warren spoke up on this, and other, prominent pastors. And so we did manage to turn the tide of Christian opinion on the issue of HIV and AIDS, and made a huge difference. And President Bush at that time passed the Emergency AIDS Response Plan called PEPFAR in Congress, and that brought $15 billion of foreign assistance into Africa, mostly Africa, to help with HIV and AIDS. So, but, as you said, that took some courage and it took some perseverance because leaders have to make difficult decisions. And sometimes those decisions, everybody's criticizing them. You've made the wrong decision, you've taken a wrong turn, and how do you have the courage to stick with it and persevere through it if you believe you're right?
That's good. That's really good. You mentioned, I think your first stop on that 18-city tour, like less than 20 people showed up after all this planning, but then you plowed through, and by the end of the tour, the message was resonating, and people were engaged.
Yeah, in fact, I wish it was 20. There were 3 people. We had a we had a pastor's breakfast in Knoxville, Tennessee. We invited 300 pastors, and we thought we might get 100 to show up. And one of the speakers with us that day was C. Everett Koop, the former Surgeon General of the United States, who was a prominent evangelical, and he was the Surgeon General when the first AIDS cases appeared in the U.S. And only 3 pastors showed up to that breakfast. We forced each one of them to eat like 20 bagels. Yeah, right. That's right. To eat the food we had already bought.
Wow. Well, another area of passion for you is refugees. I remember the Syrian refugee crisis and your work on that, but that's a much larger issue around the world. So how would you encourage Christians to engage in this particular issue?
Yeah, this is heartbreaking. There are more refugees and displaced people in the world than in any time in human history right now. I think it's something like 80 million people have been displaced and have had. And why are people refugees? People are refugees because they're driven from their homes, mostly by violence and war. So the Syrian civil war is a great example. And Syria is a country of about 26 million people, and literally half the population of that country fled from their homes because of the violence and the bombing and the chemical weapon attacks and everything else on their own people. And these are desperate people. They're fleeing for their lives. They've lost their homes. They've lost their jobs. Their children have lost their education, and they're desperate. And so one of the things that's broken my heart is how our government in the last 5 years basically closed down the refugee program. Desperate people who were thoroughly vetted by, different agencies of the U.S. government, so they're not dangerous people, desperately trying to find a new home in the United States or Canada or Europe or something. And we slashed that back, and a lot of Christians were silent about that. And, if I know one thing about Jesus Christ is that he welcomes the stranger, and especially the stranger who is fleeing for their lives and desperate for help. And so, but one of the most redemptive things I saw, David, is in Lebanon. I went into Lebanon several times during the refugee crisis, which is still ongoing, by the way. The Syrian refugee crisis is now 10 years old and still ongoing. Gosh. And you have to understand that Lebanon was invaded by Syria in the last century. And they occupied Syria with a military occupation. They killed the Syrian prime minister. They raped they killed the Lebanese prime minister. They raped Lebanese women. They occupied the country, I think, until 2006, 2005 or 2006. And then they finally withdrew, and Lebanon got their autonomy back. And 5 or 6 years later, just 5 or 6 years after this military occupation ended, Syrians are fleeing to Lebanon in the millions, in the millions, over a million. I think Syrian refugees were fleeing to Lebanon, begging for help. And first of all, Lebanon let them in. Right. Lebanon's a country
lesson number one. Yeah.
Lebanon's a country of about 4 million people, and they let in more than 1 million refugees. A country of 4 million people. That would be like the United States letting in like 50 or 60 million refugees in a couple of years. So they let them in, and then I met with these Christian pastors in Lebanon, and their churches were reaching out to these predominantly Muslim refugees. You mentioned that earlier, the bridging across faiths. And they were helping them find shelter and provide food and safety, and they were welcoming them into their community. And I asked one of these pastors, how can you do this? I mean, And he said, these people, these were our enemies. He said, these were people we hated because they occupied our country for so long. But he said, in Christian love, these are people fleeing for their lives. And when you love an enemy, the enemy can become your friend.
Yeah.
And so we are trying to show these refugees the love of Christ. And, that Sunday I went to that pastor's church, and as the music began, I saw Muslim families streaming into the church with their children, women with their husbands, coming to the church to find out about this love. Where did this love come from? Where did this welcoming come from? Talk about a good Samaritan. Lebanese Christians helping Muslim Syrian refugees who had been so cruel to them in the years leading up to this. So it was an amazing picture of Christian love and the power of Christian love to touch people's hearts.
Oh, wow. Awesome. Awesome. Well, again, thank you for championing the causes that break the heart of Christ. They're synonymous with what it means to be a good Samaritan, truly. And I can tell you're still very passionate about these issues and others. Let's turn our discussion to the book. You bring up a number of these stories in the book, but as I mentioned in your bio, this is a really interesting take on leadership. Lead like it matters to God, where you say that character matters more than results. And so you've put together a really terrific compilation of values or leadership traits that you say leaders of character would display. Do you mind giving us kind of your heart behind this? What was your motivation to write Lead Like It Matters to God? And what do you think readers will take away from the experience with it?
Well, first of all, we've already discussed I had kind of an unusual career and working in various different contexts. And, when you've been a leader for a long time, you learn a thing or two you learn some lessons, some the painful way, some you learn more easily. But I just realized that I had some things I think that would be helpful, some, call it wisdom, that younger leaders things I wish I'd known when I was 30, that I would share with younger leaders who maybe could learn from my experience. So that was one of the motivations to write the book. But I've been alarmed recently at just things that are going on around us. What's happened to our values? You look at the corporate world and things like the opioid scandal with the pharmaceutical companies and how greedy executives putting profit ahead of people kept pushing opioid drugs, knowing that not only was it causing addictions in their own customers, it was causing them to die. Mothers and fathers dying and leaving their children behind because they became addicted to these opioids. But profit was so important, they just kept pushing them, even though they knew what it was doing to people and communities. And so, there's plenty of corporate scandals you can look at.
Yeah, the Wells Fargo story, right, comes to mind. Where
the Wells Fargo
corporate
with
pressure,
the phony bank accounts.
Yep.
And then you can look at the Houston Astros cheating scandal.
Oh yeah, there baseball,
you go. When winning is everything, you start to do some things that are unethical, and you start to violate these basic principles. And then I need say very little about our politics, right? I mean, it's probably been the coarsest 5 or 6 years in our political life in my lifetime, and you ask the question, what happened to integrity? What happened to humility? What happened to compassion? What happened to courage? And where are these values? And so I kind of had this philosophy of Christian leadership that I've developed over many, many years. And one of the clarifying things I say in the introduction to the book is I say, imagine the day that you sometimes stand before the Lord. At the end of your life, you'll stand before the Lord and you're going to give an accounting of your life. And do you really think God is going to be impressed that you achieved, 20 consecutive quarters of earnings growth at your company, or that you made the biggest real estate deal of your career, in 2012 and made $50 million on it? Or, what are the things that are going to matter to God when you stand before him on that day, and it's going to have very little to do with the business you're in or the profession you've chosen. It's going to be about how you treated the people entrusted to your care, the people that you led. It's going to be about the human beings that were around you during this whole career of yours, and how you helped them to flourish. And, one of the principles in this book is that, a leader's job is, it's a little bit trite, but it's not about you as the leader. It's not about your success. And the problem with secular leadership is it's often about a leader who wants to succeed personally at all costs. And they see the people around them as just pawns on a game board that they can use to catapult themselves to a higher salary, a higher job title, a higher level of fame and celebrity. A Christian leader is just the opposite. A Christian leader should look at the people under their care and say, these are people made in the image of God. They have gifts and talents and insights that God gave them that are unique and precious. My job is to help them flourish, to help them achieve their goals, to help them become everything God intended them to be. And so you're more like an orchestra conductor than you are, a CEO sending orders out to people.
Yeah.
You're trying to bring the beautiful music out of the musicians.
That's good. I talked about, I think everybody probably knows now that I have some favorites on your list. I loved the humor one and the black shoe story. That was terrific. I've obviously the courage and perseverance that you talked about in the global AIDS pandemic was really meaningful to me. Do you have like a favorite? It's probably an unfair question because I think you had 17 or 18 traits that you wrote about. But is there one where you're like, this is it? Like everybody needs to get this one?
Well, actually, the first two chapters of my book, the first two values I talk about, and you're right, there's 17 leadership values and qualities that I think are important for a Christian leader. And the first two I write about are surrender and sacrifice. And my wife said to me as I was writing this book, she said, are you sure you want to start a leadership book with chapters on surrender and sacrifice? Because is anybody going to make it to chapter 3?
Right.
And she said, maybe you should start with success and wealth building or something like that. Because people read leadership books because they want to be more successful as leaders, right? So it's kind of a contrarian book because it's basically saying that, our goal as leaders should not be success. We may be successful. There's nothing wrong with being successful in the worldly terms, but our goal really needs to be, we want to be faithful. We want to be faithful servants. So we want to hear those words at the end of our journey, well done, good and faithful servant. That's what we want to hear from the Lord. And so the reason surrender is the first one is it really starts with a total surrender of our lives to Christ. And many of us are good at compartmentalizing our lives, right? Lord, you're the Lord of everything in my life except my money. Lord, you're the Lord of everything in my life except my career. We've all got these things we like to hold out and say, well, I'm going to manage this part of my life because, frankly, I don't trust you with it. And so surrender says, look, I'm all in. I lay everything at your feet. I am yours to do with as you please. And in a previous book, I used the metaphor of enlisting in the military. You don't enlist in the military and say, yeah, I'm enlisting, but, my wife and I want to live in Hawaii. And I only really want to work 3 days a week.
Right.
And frankly, if there's a war, I don't plan on going there, In other words, you don't submit your list of conditions to the military when you sign up, right? You go where they tell you to go, you wear the uniform they tell you to wear, you live where they tell you to live, and you serve where they tell you to serve. And you understand that. So if we're willing to do that when we enlist in the military, how much more should we be giving our lives when we enlist as a disciple of Christ, right?
Yeah.
And so when you enlist as a disciple of Christ, you don't bring your conditions and say, subject to the following conditions, I'm willing to serve. You surrender everything. And here's the beauty of it. Once you've surrendered your career, it's like the Lord's career now. It's like, Lord, if you want,
you can have a lot of impact, right? I mean,
yeah. Well, first of all, you can relax a little bit because I've surrendered this to the Lord. It's no longer up to me, and He's going to move me where He wants to move me, and I'm just going to find. And if He wants me to be in a middle management job the rest of my life, that's okay. I'll serve and I'll be faithful, and I can trust Him. I can trust the Lord for the outcome. And so, if you haven't surrendered, then it does become about you, and there are conflicts between your career and your faith, right? And because your faith is telling you one thing and your career is telling you something else, and so it starts with a surrendered leader. And surrender usually means sacrifice. You're going to sacrifice some things. You might, in my case, surrender meant quitting my job at one point and going to serve at World Vision and taking a huge pay cut. And all right, Lord, this is a big gulp in my throat with 5 kids to put through college, but okay, I'm going to trust you because not my will, but thy will, Lord. And that's a really hard thing. It's hard to surrender. And, surrender is a word that you don't hear much in leadership books. It's like leaders are saying, never surrender. Never give up.
That's right.
Take no prisoners. Take no prisoners. And so it starts with a surrender of the heart to the Lord, and then trusting Him for the outcomes. And again, you look at the leaders in Scripture. David surrendered to the Lord. Moses surrendered to the Lord. Peter surrendered. Paul surrendered. And then, only then, did God use them in powerful ways.
Well, that's good stuff, man. Where can people get their hands on the book? How can they connect with you and World Vision?
Yeah, well, the book is available pretty much everywhere you might buy books. There's if you really want to treat, you can get the audio book, and you can have me inside your head for 7 hours.
That's very cool.
Because I narrated the book.
Nice. That's good.
I always appreciate when the author does that.
But it's available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and Books A Million, ChristianBooks.com, and sites like that. So. You can follow me on Twitter at Rich Stearns, and I would encourage you to check out World Vision at worldvision.org, where you can find all kinds of ways to get engaged in being a good Samaritan in different ways, volunteering. As you and I talked about, David, running in a race to raise money for the Chicago Marathon or the Hood to Coast race in Oregon, where if you're a runner, there's a ministry where you can raise money and run for a cause, and the cause of helping children around the world.
That's awesome. Well, for all the Twitter people out there, I do follow Rich on Twitter, and you can sense the wisdom and the kind of nuggets of content and insight that come from Rich. And so I would vote for following him on Twitter, because it's you can have some of these conversations, if you will, every day, just hearing from Rich. Rich, it's been an honor of my life to be associated with World Vision. It really has. I've done Hood to Coast 4 times. Rhonda and I sponsor a number of children. I think you know that. I've been to Ethiopia twice, to Honduras once. We've done the catalog. We've done the music concerts. We've done the Global 6K here at the company. It's just incredible work, and I think Dan and I have always withheld trying to sound preachy or it's a works faith, but that whole debate. But it sure seems to me that if we're trying to be good Samaritans, if we're trying to live out the gospel, that how we treat the least of these, how we treat the marginalized, how we manage our money and our career, like you're telling us, it's just, I think it's a difference in our witness. And I do miss having you at World Vision. I love the organization. The impact that you and the team have had has just been incredible. And anyway, I'm just forever indebted to that organization and to the leadership that you brought.
Well, thanks, David. And as you know, it's not just one leader. It's hundreds and thousands, actually. World Vision has something like 40,000 full-time staff around the world. And in some of these places, and you mentioned Ethiopia, there are Mother Teresa's, most of whose names we'll never know, who are serving in very difficult conditions and being good Samaritans and giving up their own careers to work with the poor in their own country. And so it is a remarkable organization, but it's because of the people that that carry the weight every day.
Yeah. Before we let you go, we had a guest on, Dan, I think in the middle of season 2, Batya Unger-Sargon. She's the deputy opinion director at Newsweek, Rich, and she had been doing some interesting studies on unity around the country, and she stumbled upon a church in Charlotte that we know really well. We actually published the book of these two pastors in Charlotte. But she ended our conversation on this podcast, and she said, David and Dan, there are 80 million evangelicals in the United States. And I kind of want to issue a challenge to you all to make evangelicalism the voice of compassion, the movement for ending poverty and ending injustice in this country. I mean, it was one of the most meaningful calls to action that I've received. And Batya is Jewish, and she's a journalist, and she's sort of like, hey, evangelicals can lead here. So before we let you go, would you mind maybe leaving a nugget of wisdom or insight as to how Christians in this country can engage and change the way that believers in the church are involved in really tough issues like poverty, like homelessness, like injustice? Give us a little bit of your insight, of your wisdom as to how we truly can lead here.
This is a question close to my heart, because right now, if you asked non-Christians in America what they think of evangelicals, I shudder to think what the answers would be. They would not be flattering comments for the most part. And right. And yet the Christian faith in its simplest form, Jesus was asked, what is the greatest commandment? And he basically gave this answer, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and strength. That is the first and the greatest commandment. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. And so you can summarize the entire purpose of your Christian life with this: love God and love other people always, period. And what if we were known as the people who just loved people? We loved refugees. We loved the homeless. We loved the elderly. We loved people in other countries who are suffering in poverty. We were just people that our love was so great, we would do anything to help other people. And what if that was our brand, our brand image in the world? And instead of being known as the people that want to ban refugees from our country, or oppose gun control, or say climate change is a hoax, or all the political issues we get involved with are distractions from our core mission to love people in the name of Christ and to make disciples who will follow Christ in our world. And so I just think the best thing we could do as Christians or evangelicals, and if you're Roman Catholic or Lutheran, whatever your denomination is if you just became that person, like the Good Samaritan that said, I'm just going to love people. I'm going to love people of different races than me, of different socioeconomic class, of different nationalities, of different age groups. I just want to be known as a person who loves people in the name of Christ and puts my money where my mouth is, if you will. And I just think it's such a simple prescription for our Christian faith, and yet we've kind of wandered away from it. We've kind of wandered away from making it the main thing in our Christian walk. So, there's no greater testimony than I think of those Lebanese pastors loving those Muslim refugees, and then so many of them coming to church and learning about Jesus, and why? Not because of some intellectual debate or some culture war struggle, but because they felt loved and welcomed by Christians who were very different from them, but welcomed them and loved them anyways.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Outstanding.
Great. Well, thank you, Rich, for giving us an hour out of your day. I know our listeners are going to enjoy it, and I hope that you guys are inspired to go get Lead Like It Matters to God. Amazon, I think of the impact will be
There
felt.
you go. Dan, I feel like we got to call Mike Gillespie and tell him that we're ready to go to Kenya and see some of the results of our work and serve some people. What do you think?
You don't have to convince me to do that. I'm always ready to go on a trip. So I would love that.
Awesome. Well, Rich, please give our best to Reneé and to the family. And as Dan mentioned, thank you so much for joining us today on this podcast. Super meaningful. And I love how you're finishing well. We talk a lot about finishing well, and you're just an inspiration to all of us. So thank you so much.
Yeah, well, don't call me finished yet. So.
Finishing.
I'm at the 2-minute warning, but I'm not finished.
There you go. Outstanding.
All right, guys. Well, I'm your host, Dan Riveros, with my co-host,
David Hendrickson.
And we are walking through Samaria. Don't forget to subscribe, leave comments. Let us know you're loving this stuff. Season 3, we're loving doing it. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
For more content like this, visit us at givingcompany.com. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Walking Through Samaria.